maybe they would accuse as like Jokowi before they accused the atheists. He would be accused as a non-fidel, and then maybe religious-based politics. Maybe but it's potential to continue in the next panel. Okay, I will show this our survey. So we have the survey that try to portray the index of acceptance for the cultural diversity. That this is the potential conflict also. That is this belong to the the study was sponsored by the Ministry of Religion. Our lab was hired by them to study this. So so what we can learn from this result, see, this is some of the indicator that we would like to predict or to portray the index of the fragile of to become conflict. So there is the religious ideology, religious intolerance, feeling of injustice, collective narcissism, political intolerance among them. I will skip. So this is just to show you that the red one is a problem in this country now. We have a low score for the national identity adherent, the strengthening of ideologi agamis. I'm sorry, this is still in Bahasa Indonesia. This is the problem in political intolerance, and also some also support the violent like performed by the terrorist group. So we have also still problem in political tolerance. It make us worry. See that some provinces very low score in the political tolerance score, and this political tolerance usually correlated with the political ideology. The more strength the religious ideology, the more intolerant. So this is worry us very. So in conclusion, I think that Indonesia still has a problem of religious-based ideological tension that now some beneath the surface, but some in the surface, because we have problem now in the hate speech or hate group sentiment in the social media, and also in the society. So maybe this is challenge for implementing Pancasila. This is long way to become the pluralistic, harmonious, and democratic modern Indonesia. At least some indicators support this fact. This is not good, not so good. So what make us worry now, during the election, the political elite also took advantage. They know that most of the Indonesian people still dreaming of what they call Islamic societies, and then because the majority Indonesian Muslim is the sentiment is quite strong. If you just excuse the people are infidel or they're good in religious, so you are in the dangers. So maybe people quite be anxious when they're told, okay, don't choose the president that is the president that not Muslim or infidel or kafir. So this is the situation. At least we have experience in the Jakarta 2017 the governor election. At the time, Ahok versus Anies Baswedan. You know the situation. This is very so what makes situation now becoming worse in social media, because some of the political elite or buzzer or or what do you call it, influencer, try they have the role to increase the political polarization. So I don't know, maybe we need to encourage political elites or influencers to reframe themselves for being involved in political polarization, I think. Okay, thank you. This is my brief presentation. We'll continue to the next speaker.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Muluk, for that very insightful presentation. I'm sure we're all looking forward to the Q&A later on, where we can discuss some of the points that you've raised as well. Next, we have Dr. Hugh Y. Wing, who will be discussing the landscape in Malaysia. Do let me introduce Dr. Hugh. He is a research fellow at the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, IKMAS UKM. His research interests include the intersections between ethnicity, religiosity, class and politics in Malaysia and Indonesia. He writes about Chinese Muslim identities, Hui migration, social media and Islamic preaching, and the urban middle-class Muslim aspirations in Malaysia and Indonesia. Dr. Hugh will be presenting on social cohesion in Malaysia amidst changing political, media, and socio-religious landscape. Dr. Hugh, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. Salam sejahtera. Can you hear me well? Okay, yes. Many thanks for this invitation and giving me this opportunity to share some thought on this very important topic. Today, I will mainly share my view on challenges of social cohesion in Malaysia and maybe a little bit of reference to Indonesia as well, which Prof already discussed in quite an intensive way. Amid changing political, media, and social religious landscape in Malaysia. My personal research topic has been including various cultural, political, and socio-economic trends among Muslim societies in Malaysia and Indonesia. And one of my research concerns is about the possibilities and limitations of religious inclusivities or cosmopolitanisms amid trends of Islamization or assertive pieties among Muslims in both countries. Let me briefly illustrate a few case studies here. First, this is based on my research. First, I think over the last decade, there are increasing number of Chinese style mosques in Malaysia and Indonesia. I think there's about more than 20 Chinese style mosques have been built across cities in Malaysia and Indonesia. I think this somehow shows that there's acceptance of cultural diversities among Muslim societies, and also there are cosmopolitan places where Muslim and non-Muslim can get together. However, at the same time, they are also, based on my other research, they also observe a trend of making halal and sometimes even Muslim-only space in urban Malaysia and Indonesia. From halal restaurants, Sharia-compliant hospital, Muslim-friendly hotels, to these Muslim-gated communities or Muslim-only gated communities in Depok or suburban Jakarta. Of course, it's unfair to claim that all these places might undermine social cohesion, but some of them, such as these Muslim-gated communities, could further promote kind of segregation, not only between Muslim and non-Muslim, but also between different socio-economic statuses and also religiosities within Muslim themselves. And third one, I think this also mentioned in Prof. Hamdi research just now. I saw the name, Felix Yao. This is also my other research on increasingly social media savvy yet conservative inclined preachers in both Malaysia and Indonesia. For example, Felix Yao, a Chinese convert and a supporter of Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, which has been banned in Indonesia. He has more than 5 million followers on Instagram. His opponents label him as a radical and intolerant preacher, which indeed he is, because he always uses the term kafir, anti-LGBT, anti-democracy, and the list goes on. But his followers disagreed. Instead, his followers see him as a down-to-earth, friendly, and a fun figure. So indeed, I think we witness a kind of beautification of radicalism, as well as extensive network of preachers and activists who are sharing similar hateful content in different formats, targeting different audience in different platforms. So I think this poses serious challenges to social cohesion in Indonesia and also in Malaysia. Now back to Malaysia, I think there's also growing visibilities of right-wing activism online and offline in Malaysia. ISMA, Ikatan Muslimin Malaysia, is a far-right Islamist group. On one hand, it conceals its exclusive ideology by running a proxy organization, so-called Malaysia Alliance of Civil Society Association in the name of civil society. And they also talk about Islamic phobia, often to silence critics towards conservative Islamization agenda, and also so-called defending family values, which is actually promoting an anti-LGBT agenda. But on the other hand, they also run campaigns on Facebook to expose, to criticize, and to spread hate against various minorities, such as LGBT and also kafir, or so-called infidels or non-Muslims. Not only run on offline campaign, online campaign, they also run like anti-IS rally, a huge rally to against International Convention of Eradicating Racial Discrimination. And also they make films, Mat Kilau, to promote Malay Muslim unity. And also in recently concluded general election in Malaysia, the Islamist party PAS has also adopted such hate campaign on TikTok, which partly, I say partly, not only the reason, but one of the many reasons contributing to the success of the Islamist party, which is the biggest party in Parliament of Malaysia today. There are messages urging Muslims not to vote for non-Muslim, not to vote for kafir, and warning Muslims against the threat of liberals, LGBT, Christianizations, and the list go on. I mean, this is quite not so much different from what happened in Indonesia in some way. All this contributing to the polarization in multi-ethnic and multi-religious Malaysia. Of course, amid this growing right-wing trends, there are also initiatives to promote a more inclusive, if not more moderate Islamic discourse. I mean, in Indonesia, you have Nahdlatul Ulama, Islam Nusantara. In Malaysia, you have Cosmopolitan Islam by ABIM, Malaysian Youth Association, Youth Movement, and also Compassionate Islam by Ikram Pertubuhan Ikram Malaysia. And of course, recently, Anwar Ibrahim with Malaysian Madani. All this illustrates different trends among Muslim societies. There are huge challenges, but there are also some hopes. All these have implications on social cohesion in Malaysia and Indonesia. What social cohesion means and how we can understand social cohesion in the context of Malaysia. For me, social cohesion implies that people from different backgrounds, be it ethnic groups, religious, gender, sexualities, and also socio-economic status, can live together. And if possible, also work together to fight against exclusion, discrimination, and marginalization. Of course, I think it also is important to acknowledge and respect the diversity within the group, not only intergroup, but also intra-group diversity. And since independent, I think the main issue has been nation building, emphasize common national identity, be it Malaysian, Singaporean, or Indonesian. Of course, I think there are various challenges, transnational flows, regional dynamic, local politics, that pose challenges to this nation building. And also, I think I will further discuss the new developments that have impact on social cohesion. First, democratization and increasingly political competitions. Second, the rise of social media. And the third, the changing social, economic, and religious landscape, which I will come back to this later. Before zoom into the developments, recent developments, I think briefly share some key features on social cohesion in Malaysia. First, I think we go through ongoing oscillations between inclusive and exclusive movement or moment. It's not unusual to see a Malaysian politician using race and religions in election and to gain support, but there are also compromises being made. There are also ideas, agenda to promote moderate, more inclusive visions. You see, we have Mahathir, Bangsa Malaysia, Abdullah Badawi, Islam Hadari, Najib, One Malaysia, Ismail Sabri, Keluarga Malaysia, and now Anwar Ibrahim, Masyarakat Malaysia Madani. And second point, I think we should perhaps differentiate between political contestation and everyday coexistence. Of course, they are interconnected, but I think in many cases, people still appreciate diversity and peaceful coexistence, although there are heated political competition. I think this also leads to the third point, which explains why, although various tensions happen and persist, there are fewer physical conflicts or cases of violent extremism in Malaysia. And fourth point, I think there are many examples of trans-ethnic solidarities, such as Stratsea rally, the But there are also racialized mobilizations, such as the anti-ISIS rally. Interestingly, both are the major rallies in recent Malaysian history. One is more about trans-ethnic solidarity, but the other one is on rallying upon defending Malay Muslim rights. Of course, now we go talk a bit about political Islam in Malaysia. I think in terms of Malay Muslim politics in Malaysia, Malay nationalism and Islamism or political Islam are two main persisting forces in Malay politics. Of course, there are also left and liberal forces, and also non-Muslim play an important role. But due to time limit, I'm not going to that. So focus on political Islam, which is my research on. Of course, I think there are also huge spectrum within Malay nationalism and political Islam. There are inclusive and exclusive forces within these ideologies. And also they sometimes intersect, contradict, compete, and also collaborate with each other. I think most of you know, I think Malaysian politics is very complex and very fluid today. As you see, there's many actors of political Islam. Due to time limit today, I will discuss the three of them, three key Islamic organizations: ABIM, IKRAM, and ISMA. ABIM, the Malaysian Muslim Youth Movement, Malaysian IKRAM Association, IKRAM, and Ikatan Muslimin Malaysia, ISMA. These three are urban-based Dabiyah and Dakwah or preachings or organizations in Malaysia. In different way and to different extents, being influenced by the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood, but they have different manifestation. Also, their members are mostly urban, educated Muslim middle class in Malaysia. They share similar conservative social and religious values. For example, they are against LGBT, and they think politics and religions cannot be totally separated. Yet they have different approaches when dealing with multiculturalism and also democracy participation. This can reflect by seeing how the event they organize. For example, ABIM organized this event, a seminar on Bangsa Malaysia, to build a Malaysian nations. IKRAM organized Chinese New Year open house. So you can see they are more culturally inclusive. But ISMA, on the other hand, organized protests such as anti-ISIS or protests about upholding Malay Muslim rights and so on and so forth. Indeed, this can reflect in their recent campaign. ABIM and IKRAM promoted vision of cosmopolitan Islam, IKRAM on compassionate Islam, trying to promote inclusivity and diversity within Islamic framework. But on the other hand, ISMA insists that Malaysia should be a negara Islam, should be an Islamic state with slogan Melayu Sepakat, Islam Berdaulat, calling for Malay Muslim unity. ISMA is also behind the Buy Muslim First campaign, a campaign to urge Muslims to prioritize Muslim produced product. They often run online campaigns against various ethnic, religious, and gender minorities. They often take a further right stand on many issues. Further right, but I mean that they even take a more hardliner position than up north and also PAS and other nationalist and Islamist party in Malaysia. And therefore, I think ISMA as a far-right Islamist and nationalist group in Malaysia. Of course, I think in Malaysia, we also have a group that promote a more progressive understanding of Islam, such as System Islam, Islamic Renaissance Front, and so on and so forth. Now, let me go to the final key points I would like to discuss today. The three main challenges to social cohesion in Malaysia and also potential way to face these challenges. I think there are at least three challenges which are intersected and also overlapping with each other. The first one, the changing media landscape. In the past, I think the key issues, in Malaysia, we are talking about the state control media and also the lack of freedom of speech. But today, with the rise and popularity of social media platforms, from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to TikTok, and the list go on, they are opening up of spaces for everyone, from progressive to conservative, liberal to radical, to speak up freely. Unfortunately, we witness increasingly amount of hate speech and also hate mobilization by certain politicians, activists, preachers, and influencers online. And often they claim themselves or they use their the freedom of speech to limit the freedom of other people, especially those of minority background, be it gender, ethnic, and religious minority. The second is the changing social, economic, and religious landscape. I think there are 3 points here. First, the increasing role of Islam. Islam becoming more important and visible element, not only in political arena, but also in social, culture, and everyday life of Malay Muslim or other Muslim in Malaysia. Second, rapid urbanization and also expanding of Malay Muslim middle class, followed by a trend of halal consumption and the making of halal or Sharia compliant or Muslim friendly spaces in cities. I think the class dimension of urban Muslim has been often overlooked. And by class dimensions, I'm not talking only about the gap between the rich and the poor, but also the formation, the mobilities, and competitions of middle classes, as well as the uncertainty to achieve or to sustain middle class status among, especially among Malay Muslim society in Malaysia. And the third point, I think, is the diversity and the pluralities and competition of religious authorities. I think in the past, I think maybe we mainly focus on politicians and ulama, traditional religious scholar, but today we have many different actors. We have celebrity preachers, we have self-styled activists, we have even artists and so on and so forth. They claim themselves speak on Islam or speak about Islam or defending Islam or claim to be expert in Islam. So the diversity of actors in claiming religious authority. And the third and the last one is a changing political landscape. The democratizations and also the increasingly political competition in Malaysia, which go alongside with the ongoing Islamization. So I think before in general election in 2008, UMNO is the dominant party, and BN formula has Barisan Nasional, the National Front formulas has been seen by some as a mechanism to maintain social stability and cultural diversity in Malaysia. However, since 2008, we witnessed the weakening of UMNO and also Barisan Nasional until it lost in power in the election in January election, the 14th January election in 2018. The weakening of UMNO on one hand gives opportunity to more progressive forces, but on the other hand also gives rise to a more right-wing and exclusive right-wing activism and groups to grow at the same time. So at society level today, we see there's contestation or competition between a more quote-unquote civil and also uncivil groups at societal level. Especially during the Pakatan Harapan first administration, there are right-wing activists, especially Ismail, which I've mentioned about, they propagate Muslim insecurity, popularizing the notion of Islam is under the threat, campaigning for Muslim unity, and at the same time promoting hate against various minority groups. So in the last election, I mean the recently concluded election in last November, PAS and also Pakar Nasional, PN has also picked up some of these hate messages. So you can see against kafir, against LGBT, against liberal, against Christianizations, and the list go on. And such Muslim insecurity, whether it is manufactured, real or imagined, partly contribute to the recent electoral success of PAS in Malaysia. And I think this kind of Muslim insecurity, the call to defending Islam, will continue to be played out in Malaysia politics. Instead of seeing it as a form of increasingly Islamism, I prefer to see such trend as a rising Malay Muslim majoritarianism or populism. And even in recent interview, Anwar Ibrahim, the current Prime Minister, has to mention that his administrations will never recognize secularism, communism, and LGBT because due to these populist pressures. Now, with Anwar Ibrahim and modern Muslim groups in power, could they counter such a populist trend? Will they play the out-Islamization games? or they try to promote a more inclusive, if not progressive or more moderate Islamic discourse, something that we have to observe. And last point I want to share today, I think what can be done? I think this question people always ask. I don't have absolute answer, but there's some suggestions, some initiative that I think we can focus on. First, regulating hate speech and containing hate entrepreneurs. Of course, there are also challenges and debate on this issue. Second, enhancing democracy system, but at the same time, empowering progressive ideas. And third, promoting inclusive and moderate discourses. And I think it's also important at the same time, upholding social economic justice. So I think strategically speaking, we have to find ways to contain right-wing groups, engage with moderate and empowering progressive forces in Malaysia and also I think in Indonesia as well. I think with this, I end my presentation today. Thank you very much, and your question are welcome. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Thank you, Dr. Hugh, for sharing your thoughts. May I remind everyone that you can input your questions in the chat box.
Recording
and do
stopped.
indicate who you are directing the question
Recording
to.
in progress.
Last but not the least, let's welcome Dr. Walid Jumblat Abdullah, who would be giving us insights into the Singaporean context. Dr. Walid received his PhD under a joint degree program between the National University of Singapore and King's College London. He works on state Islam relations and political parties and elections, with particular focus on Singapore and Malaysia. He has published articles in internationally peer-reviewed journals such as Democratization, International Political Science Review, Government and Opposition, Australian Journal of International Affairs, Asian Survey, Small Wars and Insurgencies, and Journal of Church and State, amongst others. Dr. Walid will be presenting on secularism and the Muslim identity in Singapore. Dr. Walid, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So let me see. You guys can hear me well? Yeah. So I hope to be slightly more optimistic than my colleagues from Indonesia and Malaysia, and paint perhaps a more optimistic picture of Singapore. But before that, I just wanted to, it was just a thought I had when the brief for this session was given. And one of the questions was how Muslim communities, whether Muslim communities in Southeast Asia have contributed to social cohesion, or they have hurt social cohesion. And I was thinking, is there any other community that question will be asked of? Right? Would we ever ask that question of, let's say, how would it sound if I ask, has the Buddhist community contributed to social cohesion, or is it a deepened social divide, for instance, right? I just wanted to put it out there, and maybe the framing of how we are thinking about it, maybe it affects how we answer the questions and how we look at issues as well, right? Now, having said that, I'm still gonna try to answer the question that was posed to me, but I just wanted to put there as a thought exercise, right? So I will be talking about secularism in Singapore because it's vital to think about how the Singapore context is completely different from the Malaysian and Indonesian context, which both are different to each other to begin with, right? As we have heard. And we'll talk about the Muslim identity, or maybe a more appropriate one would be the Muslim identities. And what exactly are the potential pain points? The pain points would not be electoral because we do not have religious parties. It won't be electoral in the direct sense, maybe in the indirect sense. We see in Malaysia, it's directly. In Indonesia, it's more on the civil society level. In Singapore, it's a bit different. And I'll give some thoughts, maybe some suggestions on how we can move forward. And I'll just see that I am not overrunning the time. Okay. All right. So even though I said this is number 3, I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to return to this as well. Because when we think about social cohesion, we are really thinking about two things, right? One is the state-to-people relations. The other is the people-to-people relations. And how exactly is social cohesion affected through events that have unfolded in recent years? Now, one of the main things that have happened in the past few months is the repeal of Section 377A, a law which was never enforced, or was, I mean, in recent memory, at least it hasn't been enforced, but it's sort of symbolic It's a law that criminalizes gay sex or sex between men. So it's not enforced, but the fact that it's there, it's a signal of something. It has been repealed, and that has been one of the talking points that I will address in a while. But essentially, that speaks to both state people and people-people relations, as I will explain. Now, I would say there are a few main potential pain points or pain points. One is the tensions between desire for more openness and from the people. So this is state and people. So people want more openness and the state wants more political control, as any state does, especially the Singapore state, which has always been extremely cautious when it comes to racial and religious discussions. And increasingly, you see, especially younger people, and the government has also acknowledged this, younger people want more openness, especially when it comes to discussions on race and religion. And there will be this tension. So how will it play out in terms of social cohesion? Secondly, political polarization, of course, and here I would say there are two main, there are many, but there are two main ones. One is within the wider society, and you think about it as part of the culture wars between, you can think of it as woke people versus anti-woke people, liberals versus conservatives. So this is happening on the wider society. The importation or importing of the culture wars, which to some extent is inevitable, because most of Singaporean exposure to foreign influences is basically American, right? The pop culture, the movies we watch, and even Twitter. So that is to some extent inevitable. But how exactly will it play out in Singapore? And the second is within the Muslim community itself, the tensions between liberals and conservatives, right? What my colleagues would say progressives, and on one hand, and then you have conservatives on the other. And how exactly will it affect social cohesion? This is the people-to-people aspect. And finally, inequality. And why is this? This is a problem on the wider society, at the wider society level. Now, one of the things that maybe distinguishes Singapore from many other Southeast Asian countries is that trust in the government, trust in the PAP government is extremely high. And by all objective indicators, even the Edelman Barometer survey for 2022 indicates that it's at 66%. 66% of Singaporeans trust the government. So that's really high. However, if there is one potential problem, and DPM Lawrence Wong mentioned this as well, the possible factor that could undo this trust is inequality, right? Where you see the haves and the have-nots. How is it related to this particular point of my presentation? Is because it would be a recipe for disaster if racial inequality corresponds to socioeconomic inequality. And you see some of it in Malaysia, and you see some of it in Singapore as well. Not entirely, but you see some overlaps, and this is definitely a problem that we need to think about and ensure that it doesn't happen. All right, so of course, I'll just breeze through the next few slides. This is really to set the context, right? And when we think of secularism now, I think the earlier presentations talked about one of the key indicators between whether a person is moderate or conservative or progressive is whether you accept the separation of religion and politics. And that's the problem with a lot of these terms, right? Secularism, and we may if we ask a question, do you accept secularism? Well, what exactly do you mean, right? Do you mean secularism as a philosophy? Do you mean secularism as a political principle? Is it separation of church and state, or is it separation of religion and politics, right? Because as a political scientist, I would argue that there is nothing that can be separate from politics, right? The price of bread is the result of politics, right? So it should be, in my opinion, the separation of church and state, which is more feasible, which is more doable, separation between religion and public policy, right? And however, there are many different manifestations. It's not a catch-all, of course. If you think of it as on a spectrum, one is passive secularism, which is closer to the American version, and assertive secularism, which is closer to the French version, where the state is more assertive and it intervenes more, it ensures that there are no religious symbols. And you can see that Singapore is not here nor there, but it's closer to assertive, or what I would say, a more accurate depiction or description, it would be interventionist secularism, where religion needs to be managed because it is a potential source of conflict, right? So if religion can turn Singaporeans into good citizens, good, and the state tries to harness the potential of religion to make people better citizens. But if not, they make no apologies for harsh measures, right? And I'll give some of these harsh measures, and these are some terms scholars have used. I prefer interventionist secularism. And some of the manifestations, right? You think about the Internal Security Act, which was just invoked a couple of weeks ago. It's the law which Malaysia used to have as well. They have a different version, I suppose, now after the repeal of ISA, but where you can detain somebody without trial. And the usage of the ISA hasn't been controversial in the past 2.5 decades, because it's largely been used on religious extremists. It hasn't been. Maybe previously it was more controversial. But this is a law which gives the government some discretion. You have the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, where religious clerics are not allowed to be overtly political. You have Section 298 of the Penal Code, which criminalizes the act of uttering words with deliberate intent to wound the religious and racial feelings of any person. Now, this is quite a powerful law, right? Because if criminality is based on a person feeling wounded, right? A person's feelings being wounded, right? Then the bar is pretty low in this day and age. We have, which in Singapore, Articles 152 and 153 of the Constitution still acknowledges the Malays as the indigenous people of Singapore, which I will get to, and requires the government to have a council to regulate Muslim affairs. And we have the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, which is under the government. And we have something which is not talked about enough, I think, the Asatiza recognition scheme, which is not directly managed by the government. It's by the religious clerics, but it's under MUIS, at least indirectly, directly plus indirectly. And where to teach Islam in Singapore, you need to be certified, right? And this differentiates Singapore from a lot of, now you can already think that both the positives and the negatives of this, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious because it's going to be more and more bureaucratized, and of course there will be more self-censorship and so on. I included this to show that it's not Islam that is singled out, right? Islam is not the religion that is singled out in Singapore. The government is basically an equal opportunity offender in a way, right? Because the Marxist conspiracy arrests in 1987, 22 Catholic activists were arrested for allegations of being subversive. Now, that is a pretty controversial episode. But in any case, the point is Islam is not singled out for special attention. It is any institution, any religion that can potentially be a problem for social cohesion or can be a problem for the state, they would face the brunt of interventionist secularism as well. Now, and of course, you have the co-optation of the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, but also the Singapore, I would say generally, the ulama in Singapore, either they are co-opted or they are non-confrontational towards the state. Right? And I have done interviews as well with many of the ulama, and some of them, they are just apolitical, so to speak, or they identify themselves as political. They think of themselves as apolitical. Some of them, they are just very pragmatic. They say, oh, it's not worth it because the ARS, I don't want to discuss things that could potentially jeopardize my ability to teach Islam in Singapore. Right? And you think the relationship between the ulama and the state is one of cooperation. So on the left, you see the religious rehabilitation group. In this picture, if you can see my cursor, so this is on the left, you see 3 ministers in that picture and maybe a couple of religious clerics, right? The religious rehabilitation group works closely with the government. On the right was a task force set up by the Minister of Muslim Affairs and the government essentially with religious scholars to deal with COVID. This was at the early stages, and Singapore, of course, was, I think, probably the first country, but definitely one of the first 3 countries in the world to close down the mosque for Friday prayers during COVID. And that was also possible because of this symbiotic relationship, this cooperative relationship between the government and the ulama. And there was no major backlash from any of the ulama, right? Partly because mostly because they agreed with it, but partly also if the government has made that decision, then it's very difficult to disagree with it. But I think largely there was buy-in, right? So the relationship is not just that of coercion. It's not that at all. It's really, there's a lot of buy-in on the part of the religious elites. But of course, you have the Muslim issue, right? Is you have the burden of history. Of course, Singapore is surrounded, the Chinese nut in a Malay nutcracker, the indigeneity of the Malays, and therefore the issue with the indigeneity of the Malays comes with Islam, because Islam and Malayness are associated, as we all know, in Southeast Asia, and it is the government's duty to protect the religious interests of the Malays. And Islam, of course, it may be problematic for a nation state because of extremism, because of clash of civilizations, and so on. And I really wanted to talk about this, right? When we talk about the Muslim identity in Southeast Asia, now this is not unique to Southeast Asia. Of course, you think about Europe and you think about America, right? The good Muslim, the bad Muslim. Like, who sets the narrative, right? Who is a moderate Muslim? Now, by definition, this is a political endeavor, describing who is a moderate Muslim, right? Most Muslims would consider themselves moderate Muslims. Even extremists would say they are moderate Muslims, right? But in defining this, a lot of times it is a political endeavor, right? And of course, recently there's this idea of Arabization, which has sort of been embraced by some people within the establishment as well. The idea that, oh, Muslims are becoming more Arabized, and one of the evidences for that, and it's a problem, right? It's a problem. So the narrative goes, one of the problems is they don't say Selamat Hari Raya, they say Eid Mubarak, right? When actually in my opinion, that's an example of the Anglicization of Muslims, not the Arabization of Muslims, right? The entire English-speaking world wishes Eid Mubarak now, right? People don't even speak Malay, but somehow they have turned it into, or some people have turned it into a narrative about Arabization and Muslim identity and social cohesion, right? And as I said, the culture wars, and think about the LGBT issues, where do Muslims stand on this? And this is sort of a conundrum for Muslims, because, and this is especially evident in the West, in Muslim minority countries, right? Where generally the Muslims support the party on the left. Generally, of course, there are exceptions, but voting patterns-wise, generally, the Muslims in UK vote for Labour, for instance. The Muslims in America vote for the Democrats. But then the left is also the ones who are more socially liberal, right? And Muslims are more socially conservative generally. So how do you deal with this, right? And so you see, it's kind of a strange bedfellows situation, even in Singapore, where the conservative Muslims were in cooperation with the conservative Christians on the issue of Section 377A, on the issue of repeal, or on homosexuality issues, right? Now, and we know that the conservative right, they, in America at least, not in Singapore, but in America, they are not particularly fond of Islam and Muslims in many situations. So you sort of have a weird situation where Muslims don't really belong on the left nor on the right, and you have to navigate your way around based on political opportunities, right? And of course, securitization of identities, I started off by saying that even the narrative, right, of us saying that, oh, are Muslims bad for social cohesion, right? And I think that this is almost unique to Muslim communities, right? And legitimacy of religious elites and institutions. I think it's extremely important for us to think about this, because yes, it's good that the religious elites are close to the government, you can get things done, but it may erode the legitimacy of the religious elites as well. That's something for us to think about. Now, I mentioned this just now, tensions between desire for more openness. Now, the government has always adopted this, oh, we have closed door discussions for sensitive issues. But this is something that will not fly with the younger generation. They'll say, who gets invited to these closed doors? Who asks the difficult questions, right? These are things that we do not know what happens behind closed doors. Why are we as equal citizens not allowed to participate in this dialogue, right? So we need to think about that. And I think that's a pain point. Polarization, as I said, the culture wars, and where do Muslims position themselves within this? They are in a weird place, and it's not just, and you see this developing already, right? So I had this discussion with somebody. I said, what if I believe that a secular state shouldn't ban gay marriage, which I do. I think a secular state shouldn't ban gay marriage. So Singapore actually should, as a secular state, allow gay marriage. But as a Muslim, I believe gay marriage is wrong. Is that bigotry? And that person said yes. That person said yes. This liberal intellectual, and I find that astonishing. Right? I find that astonishing. So, how do Muslims navigate this wider culture wars debate? Right? And within the community, you have liberals and conservatives, and of course, liberals are more likely to be in better they are more likely to be better positioned vis-a-vis the state. I already mentioned racial inequality. If it corresponds to socioeconomic inequality, that's a recipe for disaster. And that is something, and the government has also acknowledged that, and that is something to be worked on, right? So some concluding thoughts, right? And I thought, if we are going to view Muslims as equal citizens in the polity, right, that comes with the freedom of expression to articulate their thoughts, right? And dissenting views should be welcome, should not be securitized, and that also includes conservative views. Secondly, you must have independent individuals and organizations. Not everyone needs to be under the ambit of the state. To provide alternative viewpoints, so that you are, sorry, that's 20 minutes, but I only have one more bullet point, if you could indulge me, Diana. And finally, I would say open discussions mean open discussions. And one of the things I have found increasingly from people who say they want more open discussions, they want more democracy. Like, for instance, in Malaysia, I've seen some people saying, oh, we shouldn't have let the 18-year-olds vote because they were voting conservatively. So that means you don't believe in democracy, right? You just believe in democracy when you win, right? So open discussions mean open discussions. We cannot say we want more open discussions. Oh, but your view cannot. Your view is too racist, right? I'm talking about Singapore, right? I'm talking about minorities. You cannot say that, oh, the Chinese cannot participate in this discussion because that you are a male Chinese, you don't have a right. I think that is not useful moving forward. And that's all I have, and I'm happy to elaborate and answer any questions. Thank you, Diana.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Walid. And I'm sure what you've shared has encouraged us to think even deeper, building upon what has been shared by Dr. Muluk and also Dr. Hugh. Now, let me remind everyone again, if you do have questions, you can input it in the chat box and we'll be taking questions from there. But it seems that we do already have one. It's a pretty long question, initially directed to Dr. Muluk, but I want to kind of like expand it a little based on something that Dr. Walid also mentioned about trust. And especially in the literature on social cohesion as well. That is really an indicator that wants and needs to be measured in all over the world. Now, with regard to trust, then in the different contexts, Dr. Walid has already mentioned a little bit about what trust is in a Singapore context. But what about in Malaysia and Indonesia? Perhaps you want to mention a little bit about what you think.
This is for Prof.
This
Muluk,
is for all.
Oh,
this
okay.
is for everyone. I'm expanding the question to talk about trust across the context.
So I'll just briefly talk about Singapore because I think I mentioned it already. I think trust in the government is high, but it was higher 2 years ago, but it could just be a statistically insignificant 68 to 66% drop. But two things, right? Trust is never unconditional. As any married person would know, trust is never unconditional and it must always be conditional. And voters and citizens are not daft. They know when something is not working for them and they will use the vote wisely. That's the first thing. And the second thing is in Singapore, there is a potential for the unraveling of this trust because of two things. One, as I mentioned, inequality. One is the leadership transition, where Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong is widely accepted and revered by many Singaporeans, and his successors do not have that level of trust and rapport with the Singaporeans, and therefore they need to build it. But that is another potential source of the unraveling of this trust. That's what I would say.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Walid. Dr. Hamdi Muluk, do you have any thoughts, especially since the initial question was directed to you?
Sorry, pardon, could you repeat the question?
The question that was in the chat box was looking, based on what you presented earlier, but basically it was on the issue of trust, or what the poster had actually called social distrust, and how that could actually, influence or affect future challenges with regard to the political stability that is happening in Indonesia right now. So perhaps you could give us some of your thoughts based on what the poster had initially requested.
Oh, okay. So there's a question I read from the chat box from Ranita. So I perceive the phenomenon as social distrust. Okay, it contradicts the Pancasila and okay. How about the social distrust in Indonesia? So in distrust index, index Indonesia, I mean that, but currently, because of probably with the high tension of politics that manipulate the identity of Islamic sentiment in Indonesia, but I think they try to manipulate the ineffective, probably the government, like the case of police brutality, and maybe the case of corruption, and maybe the case of other ineffective government, and they blame it into the Jokowi's regime, and then they accuse that see, the Jokowi regime is not our choice, because the Jokowi's is strongly they accuse that Jokowi's regime is closely related to the what we call in Indonesia asing. Asing, I mean that the foreign forces, like whatever the foreign forces, the communists, the Western, the Jews, and the Christian, and also the Aseng. Aseng, I mean the Chinese descendant, because a Chinese descendant is being stigmatized for the economic exploitation in Indonesia. They accuse that the Chinese descendant, that the conglomerate is like I feel that they oppress the economic of the majority of the Indonesian people. They are greed and so on. So if there is any ineffective in Jokowi's administration, it is attributed to the sin of Jokowi as what they call it, the embrace the forces of Asing and Aseng, that, and then make the narration justify this narration, because this is this Asing and Aseng reflect the infidel forces, So that's for the people that do not understand the situation. They accept this narrative and that make them easily to become radicalized and or maybe to strengthen their giro, in passion in Islamic struggle. So now the number of moderate Islam that try to what do you call becoming the radical one is rising, but approximately if we see the survey, the trust to government is still in the good numbers. It's around 60 to 70%. I mean, for the Jokowi's administration, that's probably make us quite stable. But I think that the proponent of dissatisfied Muslim conservatives is around 30%, but they are very aggressive in the society. I mean that in terms of campaign for the other people, but this is our problem now. Although smart, but they are very radical. The conservative one, I mean.
All right, thank you so much for that. Dr. Hugh, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Maybe let me briefly address this question. I think there are two issues here. First, I think is trust towards government, towards politicians, towards political parties, and whatever system. And the other one, I think, is social distrust among different groups, ethnic, social, religious group in Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore. So I think the two different kind of topics or themes. I think, of course, I think there's on the distrust of politicians and religious authorities is something that might give way to new form of political oppositions and also new form of religious authorities. And I think there's one question on corruption before. I think whether in many ways, I think Islamists or political Islam, some conservative Islam, they also always liberal equal to corrupt. In Malaysia up north or Indonesia, I don't know, Suharto region, the secular one and the secular is corrupted, and the Islamic is a solution to solve the problem. I think these are one of the things that maybe that's why I think upholding social economic justice is also important to solve the social cohesion. I think in the recent election in Malaysia, Pakar and PAS also play up anti-corruption. Of course, Pakar, the Paris, and also Pakatan Harapan, the whole coalition of whole audience. But by Pakatan PAS, they add one more layer to anti-corruption, but also defending Islam. So we can anti-corruption, but we also upholding Malay Muslim rights. So partly explain why they get a lot of protests among Malay voters. This is one layer. Another is about social distrust or between different groups within inter or inter-religious group or any groups in Malaysia and Indonesia. I think there are often different views on the role of religious, on the role of groups and religious in Malaysia and Indonesia, and they try to make compromise to reach a consensus that we can live together. I think in this process there are groups that are preaching these diverse forces, but there are also groups that are playing a more divisive role, like splitting, creating more trust against the people. I think in Malaysia there's right-wing groups. Islam is under the threat because of Chinese is in power, blah blah, and they're kind of promoting distrust different groups. But of course, on the other hand, there are also groups that try to bridge differences. So I think we see both forces competing with each other.
Yeah,
I hope I answered the question.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. And if I may just remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please put it in the chat box. But if there are no other questions, let me just continue with it. On All right. Let me just continue with this topic on trust, right? Throughout all three presentations, one thing that was pretty obvious to me at least was that there were a lot of names or labels being used. So one of the things that, Dr. Walid rightly pointed out is, moderate Muslim, who sets the narrative. But across all presentations, terms like liberal, secularist, moderate, so on and so forth have been used. So the question here would then be, how useful are these labels, especially when contributing to the idea of social cohesion in a different context? And anyone, any panelist can contribute to this.
Thanks, Zee. If I could take a step at it first. So I think that's an excellent question. These terminologies are contentious, they are political, and I think even in my usage of them, I have to acknowledge I'm also contributing to this, right? But that's how it is, right? We can't live our lives without labels, right? We have to use them somehow. Otherwise, we cannot describe anything at all, especially social phenomenon. So to get around it, I think we must be nuanced and we must use the labels in a good faith manner, right? So for instance, in Singapore, the liberal Muslims, the people whom I call liberal Muslims, they call themselves progressives. They detest the word liberal. Because to be a liberal Muslim, there's a connotation there that you are a lesser Muslim, a connotation from conservative Muslims. So they do not like to use that word. And I understand that, but I am not using it in that way. I am not putting a normative value judgment when I use liberal and conservative. So the way I use it, so a liberal Muslim is somebody who is more critical of the Islamic tradition. And there are some other factors, or some other traits, and you can see it being manifested, especially in terms of gender and LGBT issues. Whereas a conservative Muslim is somebody who's more adhering to the tradition. And of course, it's a spectrum. It's not a dichotomy. It's a spectrum, but I think it's useful to have that spectrum. And I would say majority of Muslims in Singapore, but also in Malaysia, I'm not saying it's a small majority. I would say by and large, they are still conservative. So I think it's not useful also to alienate the majority of Muslims. So just I think intellectually we should be fair in the usage of the word, but also I think just pragmatically and politically we should understand that when we are using liberal and conservative, we're not putting any negative connotation. At least that's how I use it.
Thank you so much for that. What about Dr. Hamdi Muluk or Dr. Hugh? Would you have anything to add?
I think that what we have faced today concerning the issues of is stigmatized. This is not good. I mean, the label is quite conservative to build social cohesion in the society. Although it is quite some time we have to have our patience, in facing the, what do you call, spoiler? I mean the maybe the elite or the clerics or the informal leader that have influence in society because of their position, but they contribute to the eruption of the social cohesion because they also campaign their especially in this case of Islamic politics, their interpretation. Because what is the best is our interpretation of the how Islam should be embraced to the state. I research on much on on HTI, and also the hardliner Muslim group. So quite difficult to face their spoiler. Although they are not big size not big in the size. I mean that majority Indonesian Muslim is or moderate one, like Muhammadiyah, Nahdlatul Ulama is the majority. But it is also this is our passion, to deal with the what they call hardliner or spoiler Islamic the proponents, and so it is in our dilemma whether we contain them, or we embrace them. So this is difficult. So in the ideal, we should embrace them, because all being treated equal, give them expression, give them freedom. But now we are in dilemma, like Hatain and Khilafatul Muslimin. We give them freedom, we give them expression, but they proclaim that the Pancasila state is infidel, is kafir. So that attract the other their follower. That's our problem now. So now the one that now we are trying to implement, that we call that the religious moderation. It is good in conception, but it is difficult to implement in reality because there's some friction and not easily implement. But we try to hard. We try to implement this concept. This is the only concept that we have in Indonesia. Moderasi beragama, the religious moderation. Yes. So embrace them all instead of contain them.
All right. Thank you so much for that clarification, Dr. Hugh. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I think I kind of agree with Walid. I think these terms are problematic, but they're also important. I think we cannot get rid of it. We have to use the term, but I think we need to use carefully with justifications, and we don't label people simply, or just based on our personal ideology or personal preferences. Of course, I think we need to be careful on all these terms. They are not like either here or there. I think conservative, progressive, moderate, radical, they are a spectrum, a huge spectrum between these. It's in either A or B, but there are a lot of gray areas. And second, I think it's very contextual and also situational. As someone might be seen as moderate in Malaysia, but it can be seen as conservative in the context of Indonesia, because they see from different view, different contexts. So that's why we have to. And also, someone can be progressive on certain issues, but not conservative on other issues. This is quite open, quite common as well, on political issue, on religious, on gender issue. Then you can see that, how come suddenly he become conservative, suddenly he become progressive? It is depend on what issue they are talking about. And also, this is also quite common. So I think we have to be very careful. But in the past, I also very careful. I don't want to use the word moderate Islam. But sometimes we need the term to differentiate different conservative groups. I think for me, they're more or less conservative. Like in my saying, the Abim, Ikram, Isma, they are conservative. I think there's nothing wrong with conservative. It's the social values. I mean, we can agree to disagree, and it's part of democracy. But there are certain groups that they're not only conservative, but they are more maybe like HTI, as Prof. Hamdi said, they're against democracy, or there are certain groups that are more right-wing, they're promoting hateful directly or indirectly, which I think is over certain limits. So that might be, some people call it radical, some people call it extremist, or right-wing, or whatever. So I think we need certain terms to see their differences. And this terms is also important because sometimes it has political and policy implication, because we should not ban conservative groups. But if some group is over the limit, maybe certain intervention need to be taken. I mean, I'm not saying we have to ban them, but we have to do it differently. So but this term, I think that's why it's important. But we have to use it carefully. We don't say everyone is radical conservative, but we need to give justification and why we use certain term to describe certain group in certain context, in certain places. And I think this is important because this has political and policy implications.
Thank you so much for that. And kind of just to play a little bit more, just to push this further, right, on this idea of terms. Another common thread that ran across all presentations also was somewhat the idea of dichotomy, although I point taken that it shouldn't be, either or, right? It has to be looked at a spectrum. But one of the things that kind of like what stood out to me was the idea of how there were some more religious type strategies and more secular type strategies in managing society, for example, or in terms of managing specifically Malay Muslim communities, for example. And in that sense, when we look at that in the context that we're discussing of in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, how does that then contribute to firstly the idea of social cohesion, which is the topic of today, but in the larger sense, the idea of national identity, which is something that we have not really discussed throughout the session that we have had today. And when we look at society itself, whether or not there is control by the state or people-to-people relations, the idea of national identity is still quite pronounced, or is still quite discussed in the literature. So what do you think, with the types of strategies or the types of management strategies that's being used in society? What about national identity then? Anyone, is a question for anyone.
Okay, so I can take that, and maybe there's a question here. I wanted to link it to Diana's question. So to what extent the government or society could promote religious moderation without violating religious freedom? And I think this is important. I think even though we didn't discuss national identity explicitly just now, I think it's implicit in the idea of social cohesion. I think a strong national identity is crucial for social cohesion, at least if we want to achieve a state of harmony between the races. And even though maybe a national identity, it cannot, I think some people like to think it can transcend racial and religious identities. I don't think we need it to reach the level of transcending racial and religious identities. I don't even know whether it's possible. Because you don't put one of your identities at the door, right? When I'm speaking, I cannot say, oh, I'm only speaking as a Singaporean, I'm not speaking as a Muslim, right? I am all of those identities at once. So I think the strategy of promoting national identity to manage this, for me personally, it would be to be more open, right? And it is not to be more limiting, to be more inclusive, to include more people in the discussions, to include more people and have a wider identity while retaining people's rights to retain their respective identities. And it's not a clear-cut solution. I think Dr. Hugh mentioned just now, it's not easy. Like being conservative is not wrong, but being an extremist is wrong. And sometimes people are on the line between the two, right? Then what do you do, right? And it's not as clear-cut as possible. So my solution would be, personally for me, moving towards more freedom and allowing for more discussions to enable us to reach sort of an equilibrium at the national level, right? And in these discussions, sometimes people will say things that are clumsy. Sometimes people may go beyond the line a little bit. And then the first instinct shouldn't be to punish and to put them in jail or to sue them. That shouldn't be the first instinct, I think. The first instinct should be to educate and debate. And I think, that's a lofty ideal, but I think it's an ideal that if we set it, then I think we can work towards it. I don't know whether I answered your question, but that would be my response.
Thank you so much for that. What about Dr. Hamdi Muluk and Dr. Hugh? Do you have anything else that you want to add?
Yes. Ideally, the national identity is the overarching concept that put all the identity under one umbrella, the national identity. In our case, it is state explicitly in our constitution. So our identity is Pancasila. We have four foundation of our state. This is Pancasila, and the other is Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. It means that diversity, but one, and the other is the prime of our national constitution. But it is good in the paper. I just admit it. It's good in the paper, but ideally, this is the concept. It's a very ideal. But to implement this concept in the reality, this is another discussion. I mean that sometimes when we are not very effective in managing the daily business of our nation. I mean the economics and the social and the development and everything and government and the dissatisfied groups that think that this is the secular concept, the Pancasila and the Constitution, the Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, and that is they accuse it is secular. So why don't you back to the God concept? That explains the conservative turns now price because so what should we do in the future? So in my thought, this is first let's do our daily business. I mean in politics, let's do democracy. Let make the effective government. Let's make good progress, economic progress, and without this, it's really difficult to convince people that Pancasila is this is the good guidance. This is national identity is the good guidance. You know, when people are dissatisfied, they would change their identity to the primordial. The easy way is religion. That's very intuitive. Yes.
Thank you so much for that. Perhaps to wrap up the discussion, Dr. Hugh, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Just 2 point or 3 point here. First, I think to forget about Malay, Muslim, whatever. I think it's not really about which religions or which ethnic group. I think it's about how majorities groups treat minorities and how we accept difference between different groups and also within the group and also inter the group. So just happened in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore may be different. The context is we are Malay Muslim majority groups. This is one issue. And the second on the nation buildings, I think is I briefly mentioned this about nation buildings, national identities, and social cohesion. I think it's very important independent era. It has been the key issues in bonding people from different ethnic and religious groups. I think in Indonesia, Pancasila. In Malaysia, we have Bangsa Malaysia, Satu Malaysia, and now Keluarga Malaysia, and then Malaysia Madani, and the list go on. But the issue is, I think what different people might have different expectations on what the nation should be. Different nation of intent. I think Prof. Samso used the term. Even the Pancasila, I think there's a group that like FPI, they want Pancasila plus Sharia. So they want Indonesia Islamic nation state, but with a more Islamic flavor into it. Some people want a more secular, or some in the between. So I think the different imagination or expectation on how the nation should be as well. So I think it's also tricky when we talk about nation identity, what different people have different expectation. And the last point I want to make, I think is, as I observe, I think Islam playing an increasing role, and I think that assertive pieties, and that's why I think, like it or not, in some way, we still need to have certain religious approaches to deal with the rising of right-wing or extremist or whatever trend you want to call it. I think Indonesia is Nahdlatul Ulama promote Islam Nusantara, Muhammadiyah Islam Berkemajuan. In Malaysia, Masyarakat Madani Islam Cosmopolitan or Islam Rahmatan lil Alamin. So I think different group has also used, even sometimes more progressive group, they also use Islamic idioms or more in Indonesia, I think, with campaigning gender right within using Islamic framework and idioms. So I think I think somehow we have to engage with Islamic idioms and framework in promoting a more more progressive or more inclusive discourses as well. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to all our speakers. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of today's webinar on contemporary concerns of Malay Muslim communities, implications on social cohesion in the Nusantara. I would like to extend my deepest thanks to Dr. Hamdi Muluk, to Dr. Hugh and Dr. Walid for sharing very honestly your thoughts and enlightening us on the situations in a different context. And I'm sure it has definitely given us some food for thought. The recording of this webinar will be available on Pakar's YouTube channel and also on Stratsea.com. And I would also like to thank the organizers, Stratsea.com, a publishing arm of Stratosphere Consulting Private Limited, Pakar, as well as Serve Indonesia, for having all of us here today. Lastly, Stratsea would also like to invite anyone who would like to submit pitches and articles focused on Southeast Asian developments. Do visit stratsea.com for more information. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. Thank you so much to the speakers especially, and we'll meet again at the next opportunity. Thank you so much and have a good day ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Hugh.
Thank you.